The banqueting table. Rumo was carried out onto a rocky plateau with a rough-hewn circular slab in the middle, stained dark red with the blood of countless meals. This was the chieftain's banqueting table. Several demonicals were seated on the boulders nearby, beating drums or blowing seashell horns as they watched the ritual unfold with avid, envious eyes. The chieftains laid Rumo down on his back on the slab. 4 of them held his legs, while a 5th positioned himself behind his head. The latter raised his arms to the sky and bellowed at the clouds. The demonicals interpreted the answering peal of thunder as a sign of divine approval. Their banquet could commence. The one-eyed monster behind Rumo's head bent over him, opened his jaws, and prepared to sink his yellow fangs in fresh, live meat. Rumo uses his teeth. Rumo's nostrils were assailed by the metallic smell of cold blood mingled with frightful stench, the kind of mouth odor that results from decades of dental neglect. The giant was convinced that his victim would start to struggle and scream as soon as the first sinews and nerve fibers were ripped from his body, but Rumo opened his jaws too. For the first time ever, he bared his army of teeth, an array of weapons such as only a Wolperting possessed, 88 incisors, canines, bicuspids, molars, all brand new, snow white, and as flawless as freshly glazed china. They shimmered faintly in the semi-darkness because a Wolperting's teeth contain a small proportion of phosphorus. The long fangs and tiny abraders were arranged in 1, 2, or 3 rows. The eye teeth were shaped like fish hooks. The molars looked as if they'd been scattered with sparkling diamond dust. The incisors were sharp as cut-throat razors. There were also other kinds of teeth, thin as needles and almost invisible, that occupied the spaces between the bigger ones. The mouthful of biting implement seemed to have been designed by an expert weaponsmith, for woe betide anyone who ended up between a Wolperting's jaws. The demonicals uttered envious grunts and ran their tongues experimentally over their own neglected tusks. The 4 who were holding Rumo instinctively tightened their grip. The dog could show off his fangs as much as he liked. He was harmless as long as they held him down, and each one of the one-eyed monsters was far superior to Rumo in physical strength. Meanwhile, the demonicals on the nearby pinnacles of rock were working themselves into a frenzy, dancing, yelling, drumming, and blowing agonizingly discordant fanfares on their seashell horns. For a second or two, a dazzling shaft of lightning lit up the plateau as bright as day, instantly followed by an ear-splitting tattoo on the impatient sky god's celestial drum. The demonicals blinked, momentarily dazzled by the glare, and almost imperceptibly relaxed their grip. Rumo decided that the time had come to fight back. He did something that was anatomically impossible under the circumstances. He turned his head, seemed to stretch his neck to twice its normal length, and bit the wrist of the giant who was holding his right forepaw. It happened so swiftly that no one saw a thing. The Wolperting's immaculate teeth were stained with blood. The giant released Rumo's foreleg with a yell and held his arms in the air. Blood spurted from a dozen tiny puncture wounds. With his free paw, Rumo reached into the demonical's mouth, which was still open in astonishment. Gripping the tongue, he twisted it vigorously, first one way, then the other. There was a crack like a rotten branch snapping. Rumo had done the worst thing anyone could do to a demonical. He had broken the giant's tongue. Demonical's tongues. After Smike had crawled over to Rumo's cage and confided his plan, he also acquainted him with what Professor Nightingale knew about the anatomical structure of demonical's tongues. Briefly summarized, this was that while normal tongues are supported only by muscles and sinews, a demonical's tongue contained an intricate and complicated system of bone and gristle, not unlike a miniature spinal column. This osseous system was essential because the giant's tongues were heavier and more complex than that of any other living creatures. Being equipped with considerably more nerve cells and taste buds, Nightingale had also discovered this unique part of their anatomy was connected to the spine and controlled their sense of balance. If you snapped a demonical's tongue, therefore, you not only caused him terrible pain, but turned him into a totally defenseless being. Phases 1 and 2. The injured chieftain put his hand over his mouth and uttered a pitiful groan. He reeled backwards, tripped over his own feet, and tumbled over a stone parapet into the sea. That was phase 1 of Smike's plan. Snap the tongue of the first demonical that tries to bite you. That was done. But phase 2 was a considerably harder proposition. Kill as many demonicals as possible. The startled chieftains had let go of Rumo. They clapped their hands protectively over their mouths and covered away. A broken tongue! How could one living creature do anything so cruel to another? Rumo rolled over and crouched down on all fours on the blood-encrusted slab. He took one aim at the demonicles, narrowing his eyes and flexed his hind legs slightly. What came next happened so fast that all the one-eyed giant saw was another white streak of lightning. As though shot from a catapult, the Wolperting somersaulted over the demonical and landed just behind him. As he flew through the air, there was a sound like a tree being torn out by the roots. To everyone's astonishment, the demonical was standing there without a head. A scream rang out from high above. Everyone except Rumo looked up at the sky. What the giants saw was their companion's head soaring through the air in a wide arc. It uttered a final long drawn-out wail, then splashed into the sea. While two of the flabbergasted demonicals were still craning their necks, Rumo ripped out their larynxes with his claws. They clutched their gaping, bleeding throats in horror. The decapitated giant rotated on his own axis several times as if seeking his missing head. He staggered forward for a few steps, then plunged over the edge of the cliff and joined his head in the sea. Rumo had taken only a few moments to neutralize 4 of the 8 strongest demonicals on Roaming Rock. He rose on his hind legs. Although still half the size of his opponents, he suddenly looked like a colossus. The 4 remaining chieftains stood rooted to the spot. They had thought themselves the strongest creatures in the world, invincible demigods who represented a threat only to one another, and now they were confronted by a creature considerably smaller and less muscular than themselves, that had neutralized 4 of their number, including the strongest of them all. The 2 giants, whose throats Rumo had torn out, had fallen to the ground and were writhing around in a pool of blood. The demonicals who had witnessed the whole incident from the rocks nearby uttered a confused babble of cries made for the nearest caves. One of the 4 remaining chieftains came to life at last. He gave Rumo one last terrified look, turned tail, and dashed through a rock gateway through the island's interior. The other 3 stood watching this unprecedented spectacle. For the first time, one of their member had been put to fight by another living creature. They stared at each other in utter bewilderment, then lumbered after him. For a while, Rumo continued to stand there in the rain, inhaling the fresh sea air. The drums and seashell horns had fallen silent. He threw back his head and opened his jaws and let the downpour rinse his blood-stained teeth. Then he went down on all fours and bounded toward the cleft of the rocks through which the demonicals had disappeared. Smike was listening. The music had ceased abruptly. To him, an unmistakable sign that the young Wolperting had carried out phase 1 of his plan. His predominant emotion was one of pleasure, although he briefly regretted having been unable to witness such a unique spectacle, a choice form of combat technique devised by himself. Slowly he made his way to the surface. The pool had split half its contents, so the edge was at least 5 feet above him, an almost insurmountable obstacle for a sluggish and bloated shark grub, plastering its flabby body to the stone side. He clung there by suction and proceeded to worm his way upwards. He inched up the side like the basin like a monstrous slug, accompanied by glutinous sounds, then rolled over the edge and looked around panting. The island was rocking less violently, and the other captives were preserving an expected silence. Smite listened again. Screams would soon be heard. A demonical chieftain bites the dust. The first chieftain to take flight was standing in a dark tunnel, nursing his bleeding wrist. He wondered what he had done wrong. He had never harmed anyone, so why was he being punished? He had always endeavored to lead a simple, God-fearing, demonic-lean existence. He awoke in the morning, had breakfast, a squealing pig, a screaming dwarf, a thrashing octopus, or whatever came to mind, spent the rest of the morning dozing on a rock in the sunshine, had lunch, treated himself to another little nap, had supper, and then retired to a cave where the waves rocked him to sleep. He and his companions sometimes went whaling. They stood on the island's rocky pinnacles and harpooned any of the giant creatures unlucky enough to stray within range. When the island ran aground, they went ashore to forage for supplies. He could still hear the screams of the prey they had amassed through the last raid. The demonicals had laughed and sung, and he himself had blown the seashell horn. What wonderful, carefree days those had been! A big tear oozed from the giant's single eye. Now he was standing here in the dark with a pounding heart, hiding from an evil spirit. He had given some other demonicals a frightful beating, of course, and had even sent a few of them straight to the sun god in the flying mountains above the sea. But he was fully entitled to do so. He was one of the chieftains, after all. The giant suddenly remembered his friend Ock. True, he had hurt him terribly, and how? But why had Ock usurped his favorite place in the sun? He had punched his friend in the face until his lower jaw flew off, then stamped on his head until his eye oozed out. But the obstinate fellow should simply have made room for him, at least when he lost his lower jaw. But no, Ock always had to act tough. Could it be Ock's ghost that was stalking him through the tunnels, with bloodthirsty vengeance in mind? It would be just like him. He had always been inclined to bear a grudge, But how had a weakling like Ock developed such mysterious powers? Did one acquire them in the flying mountains? And why had he taken on the shape of a white dog? On the other hand, if it was really Ock, he might be able to finish him off. After all, ghost or no ghost, never had a demonical's head been a whirl with so many thoughts and questions all at once. Why was his heart beating so fast? What was this unpleasant, irresistible sensation that made his knees tremble and brought him out in a sweat? Was that his own shadow creeping along the wall? Was it Ock? What was it that he could feel in his neck? A hand? A row of teeth? A spinal cord snapped with the darkness, and the giant's lifeless body collapsed. Rumo leapt off his back. If his soul really was winging its way to the flying mountains, it would run into a terrible thunderstorm. The evil spirit. It was dark inside Roaming Rock. The frantic demonicals had omitted to illuminate the interior in the usual way, so isolated torches provided the only light. They groped their way along in the darkness, strangers in their own home. In the few places where fires dispelled the gloom, they clustered round and talked with bated breath of the ghost that haunted Roaming Rock, and was even now creeping along the tunnels, intent on killing them all. Many claimed that it would make itself invisible and turn up in several places at once. It possessed magical powers, declared someone, and it could even fly as well. Others surmised that it had come from the flying mountains, a vengeful deity born of the thunderstorm, because they had paid insufficient homage to the sun god. But most of the one-eyed giants roamed around on their own, totally disoriented. They kept blundering into each other in the dark. When two of them collided, there was a terrible scrap, which only one survived. Quite a few demonicals died by their own hand that night, and many others plunged wildly into the sea, where sharks attracted by the blood of the injured were ready and waiting. Rumo's inner eye. To his own surprise, Rumo needed no light. He could see with his nose. To him, the darkness was filled with undulating colors and thin streaks of scent. He could smell where beads of sweat were trickling and hearts pulsating with terror. He could smell the fear and desperation. It was child's play for him to locate a perspirating demoniacal. The fleeing giants left behind broad yellow streaks that offended the nostrils. He only had to follow such carpet of smells, and sure enough, it would lead him to a demoniacal quaking in the darkness, never guessing what lay in store for him. Rumo could smell his pounding heart. He could see it throbbing in his inner eye. A furious growl, a scream cut short, and another giant slumped lifeless to the ground. Then Rumo would pick up the next scent. But it wasn't always that easy. Although frightened, the demonicals were no cowards, and desperation lent them twice their normal strength. Sometimes, when Rumo failed to put an opponent out of action with his first bite, a fight ensued. Then he had to contend with a rampaging mountain of muscle, who punched holes in the darkness with his mighty fists, forcing him to duck and evade blows. In such cases, Rumo relied on his speed. He either severed the giant's hamstrings with his teeth or sprang straight at his throat. If the demonicals had a torch and were present in strength, he avoided a direct confrontation. He would snarl at them, displaying his blood-stained teeth, and disappear into the darkness to attack some lone giant wandering nearby. Before the long tunnels were strewn with dead, dying, and badly injured demonicals, their cries reverberated around the entire system of tunnels and filled the hearts of the survivors with dread. For the first time, the one-eyed monsters learned something of mortal fear, the terrible emotion their prisoners were compelled to experience daily. The persistent fear of being killed at any moment by creatures far superior to them in strength. Rumo continued to prowl through the darkness. He soon had a better knowledge than any dim-witted demonical of the network of tunnels with which the floating island was riddled. His inner eye visualized it like a three-dimensional blueprint, crisscrossed and illuminated by colored threads, undulating wisps of scent, pulsations of fear. He worked his way tirelessly and systematically through the labyrinth, sometimes killing his victims, sometimes only mauling them. The cries of the ones he only maimed and put out of action bore witness to his triumphs. Now and then he would pause at an intersection, go down on all fours, and utter a ghostly howl that was audible all over Roaming Rock. Rumo decided that it was time to release the prisoners in the cave, although he knew that they wouldn't be much help. A Hakonian dwarf couldn't have brought himself to hit a demonical with a buttercup. This had nothing to do with cowardice. Hakonians were brave and steadfast individuals under normal circumstances, but they simply couldn't do a person harm. Rumo wanted to reassure them that their troubles were over. The Hakonians flinched when they entered the cave. His white fur was completely sodden with blood. He stood there in the flickering torchlight like a statue of a vengeful god come to life, inserting the shaft of an extinguished torch through the iron ring that attached the main chain to the wall. He levered it out with a jerk. Then he made his way over to Smike. "Nice work," said Smike. "Dirty work," Rumo retorted. "Harder than I thought, too." And he disappeared into the labyrinth once more. The determined dozen. Rumo was back in the world of smells. The green glow that enveloped everything was the scent of the salt sea rising and falling beneath his feet. The fine red threads that drifted along the tunnels were the scent of spilt blood. Silently he followed the yellow streak a demoniacal had left in his wake. A second streak joined it, followed by more and more until 12 were all leading in the same direction. A dozen giants had teamed up and barricaded themselves in a cave. Emboldened by their superior numbers, they would stop at nothing. Rumo realized that. He could smell their sweat and hear their hearts beating wildly. They had illuminated their refuge with several torches whose light penetrated the mouth of the tunnel that led to it. Rumo paused just short of the cave and drew a deep breath. He had never tackled a dozen demonicals at once. No one had ever done that. But after all, he had disposed of the 8 strongest giants on the island, and they hadn't been as demoralized as these. He decided to extinguish the torches as quickly as possible and attack under cover of darkness. Going down on all fours, he darted between the demonical's legs and into the cave as nimbly as a lizard. The next moment, a torch hit him plumb on the nose. Without knowing it, he had come up against the giant with the best reflexes of all, one who had spent years training himself to stun passing sharks with a club. As soon as he saw Rumo come fleeing in, he dashed out like lightning and landed the blow of a lifetime. Rumo's world of smells exploded into a shower of multicolored sparks. The torch had singed his muzzle and blinded him at the same time. His eyes were showered with glowing fragments of pitch that stung him like pinpricks and imprinted his vision with pulsating red flecks. The startled giants formed a circle around him as he crawled across the floor of the cave, trying to rub the burning specks out of his eyes. They hadn't thought it would be so easy. He had been prepared for a costly life-or-death struggle, a costly battle with a god of death, a flying ghost, and now one blow and it was all over. They vented their relief by laughing sheepishly and slapping the lucky torch wielder on the back. They said nothing, but the looks they exchanged spoke volumes. They were going to devour the Wolperting alive here and now. Roaming rock runs aground. Bolsaton's Mike was listening again, this time with the greatest misgivings. The screaming had stopped, although he could still hear the odd groan. There were no more cries of terror or surprise. It would only be too understandable if Rumo's strength was beginning to give out and his reflexes flagging. Smike knew perfectly well that his plan hadn't really been a plan at all, just a gamble, and years of experience had taught him that when you staked everything on a single card, your chances of winning were as great as your chances of losing. Curiously enough, though, you lost more often than you won. At that moment there was a mighty jolt, and everyone hurled across the cave. The Hakonians uttered cries of alarm. The animals bellowed and bleated. Bulky though he was, Smike sailed through the air and crashed into a stalagmite protruding from the floor of the cave. With a groan, he rolled off into a big puddle formed by the water that had spilt from one of the basins. Wriggling around him were squat black fish with fearsome-looking teeth. He sat up. All was still. No more jolts, no pitching, no tossing. He looked around. The water in the pools was motionless now. Even the chains had stopped rattling against the walls. That could mean only one thing. Roaming rock had run aground. The world of sounds. Sound, Rumo thought suddenly. That was the answer to Smike's riddle. What can penetrate a wall but isn't a nail? Sound, of course. Rumo's hearing had always been good. Once back on the farm he had heard a rose rustle. As its petals unfolded, he could hear the wing beats of a butterfly and the sound of insects burrowing in the soil. But he never paid much attention to that sense as long as he could see and smell. Now he was almost blinded. His nose was so badly scorched that all he could detect with it were the wildly rotating colors of pain. Now as the demonicals closed in on him with the intention of devouring him, Rumo explored another world, the world of sounds. Anyone with average hearing could have heard the giants laughing, their feet scuffling the rocky floor. Likewise the crackle of torches and the sound of one that had blinded Rumo being replaced in its holder. But Rumo could hear much, much more. He could hear the demonicals' joints creaking and their hoarse breathing, the rhythmical thud of their heartbeats. He could hear the electrical crackle of their fur when they brushed together and the rustle occasioned even by the slowest of their movements. His ears conjured up a mental image of the entire cave, but a colorless this time. It was silhouetted in nebulous shades of gray and lacked fine detail his sense of sight and smell would have conveyed, but he could tell accurately where a demonical was standing and what he was doing. He could also hear the location of the 3 torches. That was all he needed to know. Suddenly there was a violent jolt. Rumo slithered across the floor, and the giants went crashing into the walls. For a moment they were startled, as the chieftains had been by the thunderbolt on the rocky plateau, and Rumo decided to exploit this distraction. As before, heedless of his smarting eyes and nose, he sprang up and made straight for the crackling sound of a torch. Before the demonicals could react, he had snatched from its holder. The nearest giant recovered his wits and made a move in Rumo's direction. The creaking of his knee joints was clearly audible. He raised his weapon, a short iron chain composed of massive links that jangled in Rumo's ears. He also made the mistake of blinking his only eye. To Rumo it sounded like a lizard closing and opening its gooey mouth. He thrust the torch straight into that juicy sound, and a bestial scream, accompanied by a noise like a frying fat, told him that he had hit the target fair and square. The torch stuck fast in the blinded demonical's eye socket and went out with a hiss, but his blood-curdling screams went on and on. His companions seemed paralyzed by his blood-cold act. Their ferocious determination and voracity evaporated in a flash. The flying ghost had come to life again. Rumo, who had already snatched the second torch from its holder, located the screams and doused it in the sightless giant's gaping mouth. The spectacle was too much for the others. They miled around in panic, blocking their own escape route by all trying to squeeze through the narrow exit simultaneously. Rumo took the last torch from the wall and thrust it into their confused, jostling mass of bodies. One of them caught fire. Sparks from his first set two more ablaze, and within a few seconds they were all burning fiercely. A couple of them managed to squeeze through the gap and ran screaming along the tunnels like torches on legs. The others rolled around on the floor of the cave, desperately trying to put out the flames. Rumo paid them no more heed. He leapt over the burning bodies and out of the cave. The escape. The screams had started again. They were issuing from the many throats, and they sounded even more desperate than before, so Rumo was still alive and busy completing phase 2 of the plan. Smike decided that it was time to organize an exodus from the cave. "Listen, folks," he called. "It looks as if the island has run aground. I advise you all to leave this accursed cave as fast as possible and make your way down to the water's edge. Don't be afraid of the demonicals. They've got enough on their plates. When you get outside, simply dive into the sea and swim for it. Land can't be far away. Better to be eaten by sharks than by those one-eyed monsters." The terrified Hakonians hadn't stirred once since the island ran aground. Now they pulled themselves together and made for the exit. "Incidentally," Smike called after them before they disappeared down the tunnels, "your savior's name is Rumo. You ought to make a note of it." Then he, too, made for the exit. Rumo tottered along the roaming rocks, subterranean passages. The shower of sparks in front of his eyes had subsided. All he occasionally saw were red and white specks, but he still wasn't capable of smelling anything. His warlike exertions had taken their toll. He was tired, injured, and unsteady on his legs. He heard an unidentifiable crackling sound, possibly from a discarded torch, to judge by the shadows dancing along the walls of a side tunnel. Rounding the bend, he caught sight of 3 demonicals, armed with clubs and stone axes. They were standing mutely over the smoldering corpse of one of their number. The surprise factor was equally great on both sides. The giants would probably have found Rumo easy meat in his present state, but he merely growled and bared his blood-stained teeth, and they turned and ran off. He staggered after them in the direction of the cool breeze that was wafting along the tunnel towards him. Will-o'-the-wisp Bay. Rumo emerged on the rocky plateau and looked out at the sea. The storm had abated, and the horizon was illuminated by the first rays of the rising sun. To the west, a thick blanket of inky blue clouds still hung low over the water, but the rain had stopped. A few hundred yards away, Rumo could see land. Bare sandstone cliffs and little beaches. Several demonicals and Hakonians were swimming ashore. Swarms of luminous insects were dancing above the sea, their busy hum filling the air. Some more dwarfs emerged from the cave behind Rumo. Having respectfully squeezed past him, they jumped off the rocks and into the sea. Someone had released the red gorilla and suddenly appeared beside the blood-stained Wolperting. After giving him a long look, it too jumped into the sea. Rumo was left on his own. He looked down in the water, and the sight of choppy waves turned his legs to jelly. The dry land was near. The water couldn't be very deep. There were no sharks in sight. There was probably feasting far out at sea, but they weren't the reason for his deep-seated fear. "You can't swim, can you?" Rumo knew who had spoken without turning round. Volston and Smike came crawling out of the tunnel behind him. "No," said Rumo, "I can't." "No Wolperting can," said Smike. "No need to be ashamed. It's hereditary." "You're lucky I'm still here. Climb on my back." Rumo did so. The shark grub's body felt soft but firm beneath him, and he clung to its plump curves. Smike slithered down the almost vertical rock face like a raindrop trickling down a window pane. Rumo hung on even tighter and dug his heels into Smike's yielding blubber. "It rather embarrasses me to be able to do this, but it's something I've inherited from my disgusting marine ancestors," said Smike, whose body was making hideous squelching noises as it slid down the rock. He glided smoothly into the sea, and Rumo involuntarily drew up his legs as the sea water wetted his feet. "As soon as we're ashore, I shall seek out the most decadent company I can find," said Smike. "I intend to live in the lap of luxury and sophistication. I yearn for sofas and sedan chairs, gilded columns and marble floors. Nature I want to see only in the form of well-tended gardens and oil paintings. I never want to set eyes on the sea again, or if I do, only from afar, from the terrace of my summer palace, as I gaze at it with distaste through my telescope." The insects dancing overhead glowed with crystalline colors of every shade. It looked as if it were raining diamonds. The very air seemed to be on fire. "Springtime," said Smike. "Those are will-o'-the-wisps in their mating flight. The miracle of love, my boy." We appear to have landed in Will-o'-the-Wisp Bay. It's the only place where so many of those creatures are to be found. You're another reason to be thankful. We've run aground on the shores of Hakonia. You're back home, so to speak." Like a bloated swan, Smike glided through the gentle swell, past panting Hakonians and frantic, dodgy, paddling demonicals. Swimming among them was the red gorilla, which was propelling itself leisurely on its back, with sweeping movements of its arms. The sun had almost risen, and the will-o'-the-wisps humbly extinguished themselves. They formed a long, humming, flying carpet and headed off, as if attracted by magnetism toward the dazzling orb on the horizon. The first demonicals had reached land and were running wildly along the shore. Many were already scaling the sandstone cliffs. "I can't guarantee those pea-brained monsters haven't learned their lesson," said Smike, "but I'm sure they'll treat other life forms with greater respect in the future. All the same, I wouldn't like to bet on it." Ah, land at last. He splashed another few yards through the surf and stopped. "You can get off now. It's only knee-deep here." Rumo slid off his back and promptly began to wash. The blood-stained water ran down him in discolored streams, reddening the sea at his feet. One by one, the last Hakonians waded ashore and plodded past him in silence with their heads bowed, a bedraggled procession of dwarfs. When his fur was white at last, he too went ashore. Ashore at last. Smite crawled across the beach, grunting with delight as his plump body dug a circular furrow in the sand. He let the grains trickle through his little fingers. "Land!" he cried. "Terra firma! I still can't take it in." Rumo raised his head and sniffed the air. His nose was still dripping, and it would be some time before it regained its sensitivity, but it was functioning, albeit to a very limited extent. He shut his eyes. The wisps of scent were paler and more tenuous than usual. Everything seemed to be covered with a thin film, but he could smell the sea, the moist sand, and the nearby fields of grass, and up there, fluttering high above the other wisps, wasn't that the silver thread? Yes, here it was again. It was very much thinner than before, but he could definitely see it. It was no dream. His inner eye had lost sight of it for a while, that was all. Smike's voice broke in on his thoughts. "What do you intend to do now? Are you going back to the Hakonians?" Rumo opened his eyes and looked at the departing dwarfs who were going home to their looted and devastated farmsteads. "No," he said, "I'm going that way." He pointed in the direction of the fluttering silver thread. "Good," said Smike. "I'll accompany you for a while if you've no objection." He looked Rumo up and down. "The first thing we must do is get you something to wear." Rumo looked down at himself. The morning sun was beginning to dry his fur. "To wear?" he repeated. "Why?" Bolzatan Smike bared his teeth in a grin. "We'll soon be entering civilization. You're grown up now, my son." 2. The non-existent teensies. Smike and Rumo took advantage of the daylight and remained on the move all day. Sunlight, the open sky, an unobstructed view, the countryside, clouds. It took them a while to get used to these obvious things, and although they were back on dry land, the ground still seemed to sway around like a floating island. Smike bombarded Rumo with umpteen questions as they made their way across the sand dunes. He propelled himself along like a caterpillar, with the upper part of his body erect and the lower part advancing in a series of rhythmical undulations. To Rumo's surprise, they made good progress, although Smike needed to rest considerably more often than a Wolperting. Most of Smike's questions concerned Rumo's battles in the labyrinth on Roaming Rock. How had the demonicals fought? What methods, what instinctive tactics had Rumo employed? As for Rumo's account of the episode in which they'd been temporarily blinded, Smike insisted on hearing it again and again. By evening they had reached a spot where the flat coastal plain gave way to sparsely wooded hills. There were also some bushes and shrubs from which a few berries and nuts could be picked, and they even found a tree laden with sour little apples. Rumo didn't care what he ate. After what had happened on Roaming Rock, he preferred to feel hungry rather than full up. It was almost as if he'd eaten enough for a lifetime in the demonical's chieftain's cage. The mere act of eating would always remind him of those bestial one-eyed giants, and he disliked the feeling of repletion and the lethargy that accompanied it. Sleeping and eating would never be among his favorite occupations. He preferred to be alert and hungry. Smike, on the other hand, indulged in culinary fantasies as soon as they lay down to sleep in a small copse. In him, the fresh apples that roused an almost uncontrollable craving for some decent food. He had suppressed this while on roaming rock, but now they were back on dry land. And to Smike, dry land meant lush pastures in which sleek cows munched the juicy grass that augmented their fat reserves and filled their udders with rich milk from which one could ladle delicious cream for use in the most sumptuous gâteaux, and so on and so forth. Smike's powers of imagination were almost inexhaustible. Eventually, in the midst of describing a dish in which stuffed mouse bladders played a central role, he quietly went to sleep. Rumo, too, enjoyed a really good night's sleep for the first time for ages. He dreamt that the silver thread was floating above the fields of golden yellow wheat. It had a voice this time, but the voice didn't speak. It hummed a strange and enchanting melody. Civilization. The district Rumo and Smike explored the next morning was threaded with numerous rivers and streams. Rumo would have found it quite impossible to wade through anything deeper than waist-deep stream. So Smike's ability to swim more than compensated for the many rests that they had to take for his sake. The water had transformed the whole area into a paradise. The berry-laden bushes, rhubarb plants, apple trees, and flowers that grew everywhere and attracted creatures of all kinds. Bees hummed, birds darted after insects, and the place abounded in rabbits, partridges, deer, ducks, and pigeons. Rumo could easily have killed one of the deers or rabbits, which showed little fear, but much to Smike's vociferous regret. His memories of the demonicals would have made that seem like a sacrilege. After half a day's march in the countryside became flatter and more monotonous, the rivers rarer and the tracks more frequent and well-trodden. Here and there isolated farms could be seen on the hilltops, and the scenery was dominated by fields of grain and fenced-in pasture land instead of woods and wild meadows. "Can you smell that?" asked Smike. Of course Rumo could smell it even with his dripping nose. From time now, the air had been filled with the unmistakable aroma of roast pork. Rumo had tried to ignore it because it was mingled with several other rather unpleasant smells. He could detect tobacco, smoke, and sweat, and horse dung. "Somebody's doing some serious cooking somewhere," Smike said in a tremulous voice. "3 of them, over there behind the hill." Rumo pointed in the direction from which he was receiving this information. Smike put on speed. In a dip beyond the hill, the intersection of 2 tracks, stood a gloomy building, rather inexpertly knocked together out of rough-hewn timber. The beams were crooked, the windows triangular, the gables absurdly askew. Smike could now smell it too, that blend of cold ashes, burnt fat, and stale beer. Only one type of building smelt that way. "An inn," he gasped, licking his lips. Tethered beside a drinking trough outside the building were 2 farm horses, black coats and white manes. "There are some Bloodums in there," Smike whispered. "At least 2 of them. Only Bloodums ride plow horses without saddles. That makes at least 3, including the innkeeper." Rumo nodded. 3 of them, all unwashed. Smike thought for a moment. "Listen," he said at length. "I've a favor to ask, one that probably won't appeal to you." Rumo pricked up his ears. "When we go inside, I'd like you to walk on all 4s. Why?" "It's a combat tactic I call a surprise element. You're bound to find it useful." Rumo recalled how he'd entered the 12 Demonicals' cave on all 4s. That hadn't been such a good idea. "Don't say a word when we get inside. Not a word, understand? I'll do the talking. At some point I'll leave the room for a minute or 2. All you have to do then is listen carefully to what's said. There are 2 possibilities. It'll be either something good or something bad. If it's bad, give me a sign when I come back. Paw the ground with your right foreleg. The rest will come by itself." Rumo nodded and went down on a horse. The Glass Man Tavern. There's a story attached to every building. The story could be more exciting or less, depending on who lives there. If a house is occupied by a Haakonian farmer, the probability is that he keeps his garden well weeded and pays his taxes regularly, so the story of this house will be relatively uneventful. If the occupants are werewolves, on the other hand, they spend the day in sealed coffins in the coal cellar, and at night, when the coffins creak open, scenes of unparalleled horror unfold. Thus, Simonian buildings are associated with all kinds of stories. This one is the story of the Glass Man Tavern. Kromek Tuma was a second-class Bloodum, which meant that he was regarded as badly off, even for a Bloodum. At some stage, nobody knew exactly when, because no self-respecting historian would ever have wasted its time on the history of their breed, the Bloodums had established a fairly simple class system designed to distinguish between not too badly off and very badly off Bloodums. However, it soon turned out that the borderline between moderate and abject poverty was fluid and hard to define, so this class system lapsed into oblivion as some time went by. All that needs to be said here is that the yardstick of the old class system had been applied to Cromac Tuma. It would have been necessary to invent a third class. Of all the inhabitants of Zamonia endowed with the power of speech, the Bloodum was regarded as the life form with the least well-developed social instincts. Most Bloodums pursued occupations in which oafishness and insensitivity were not only tolerated, but indispensable. They became bouncers or mortuary attendants, infantrymen, or fairground boxers, slaughtermen, or executioners. Anyone lacking the qualifications even for those jobs opened an inn like Cromac Tuma. Cromac hadn't always been an innkeeper. He had embarked on a comparatively respectable career by Bloodham standards, having joined the private army of Hussein Banana, the Ornian princeling, at the age of 10. Veteran of 25 years' service, he had taken part in all of Hussein's frontier wars, losing 4 toes, 1 eye, and 2 fingers in the process. His body bore 114 large scars and countless smaller ones. He was also deaf in 1 ear, having fired too many cannon, and suffered from occasional spasms in the spine where a poisoned arrow had struck him. None of this would have ever induced Cromac to change his occupation. No fate and his economic situation were responsible. One day, Prince Hussein had paraded his troops and announced, "Men, I'm bankrupt. Sorry not to have any more welcome news to impart, but my treasury is empty. Those confounded flamethrowers which persisted in firing backwards cost a fortune to develop, and our attack on Florence has not been crowned with the success its strategic brilliance deserved. In short, men, you're dismissed." Cromac would never have believed, even in his wildest dreams, that a prince could go bankrupt. He had envisioned himself as a military instructor at the age of 180 and a retired war veteran at 250, yet here he was unemployed at 35. Together with the other Bloodums, he lynched the prince and carried his head around on a spear for an hour or 2. This didn't get them their jobs back, however, so they split up and roamed Samonia alone or in groups. Cromac set off in the blue with a fellow veteran named Tok Teko. For some years, they scraped a living as highwaymen and paid duelists. When Tok was so badly mauled by savage forest werewolves that Cromac had to bury him alive, that being the only way of preventing people mauled by werewolves by turning into werewolves themselves. Thereafter, Cromac trudged on alone, waylaying any travelers unfortunate enough to cross his path and stealing their money and provisions. One day, having penetrated ever deeper into the southwest Samonia, he came to a crossroads and wondered aloud which direction to take. Then he heard a voice. "Cromac Tuma," said the voice. "Huh?" said Cromac. "Snurtfins mfdratblah." Cromac Tuma scratched his head. He hadn't understood a word apart from his name, and no wonder. The fact of the matter was, he was in the process of going insane. Not that he realized it, of course. He was suffering from a hereditary mental disorder, quite commonly found in Bloodums. This condition, which caused metabolic disturbances in the brain, had chosen to attack him at a particular moment. A relatively predictable disease with fairly typical symptoms. It made his victims hear voices and commands or music from other planets. Having rotated on the spot for several days, barking madly, they would sometimes return to normal for months on end. What happened at the crossroads that day was that the disease was trying to formulate its first commands. Cromac stood there for the next 3 days, barking like a dog, rotating on the spot and endeavoring to make sense of the unintelligible gibberish in his head. Then all of a sudden the voice became crystal clear in his head and said, "I command you to build an inn here." "Who are you?" asked Cromac. "I am, the glass man," said the voice. As far as Cromac Tuma was concerned, that was reason enough for him to build an inn, a thoroughly favorable outcome to the disease, because many of its victims received far stranger orders, some of them bloodthirsty in the extreme. In Cromac's case, his sick brain had laid the foundations of a comparatively healthy business, because inns were always in demand, especially in such outposts of civilization. Zorda and Zorilla. By his standards, Cromac Tuma was in a fairly stable mental state when Smike and Rumo approached his inn. Rumo growling and walking on all fours as instructed. Having had at last attack 3 weeks earlier, the innkeeper could look forward to 2 or 3 months of normality. He had recently acquired some regular customers in the shape of 2 Bloodums named Zorda and Zorilla, who had found him after his last seizure. To his horror, Cromac had discovered that some shameless bandits had taken advantage of his helpless, deranged condition, and looted his storeroom in the interim. That was why Zorda and Zorilla dropped in every day, just to see that all was well. They had quickly become a permanent feature of the Glassman, eating and drinking a great deal, and playing cards all the time. They insisted on putting everything on the slate, so their bill was mounting steadily. Zorda and Zorilla were in an irritable mood, unlike Kromek, but they took care not to show it. On their first visit to the Glassman a few weeks earlier, Kromek had been standing behind the counter barking. To begin with, they had merely found this amusing. Then when they helped themselves to the wine barrel, without being asked to play, it had dawned on them that the innkeeper was completely incapacitated. They sat down, drank his wine, ate his roast pork, and waited. After a couple of hours, Kromek started to rotate on his own axis, still barking. They watched him all night, egging him on and getting disgustingly drunk. When they awoke the next morning, Kromek was still behind the counter. Whimpering now, they proceeded to ransack his storeroom and bear off its contents to their lair. Kromek recovered his wits just as they returned to the inn to complete the job, so they put on an act and blathered something about some bandits who had taken to the hills at the sight of them. Kromek thanked them effusively, and Zorda and Zorilla now visited the Glassman every day, waiting for him to start barking again. But Kromek's mental condition remained stable. He carefully noted every drop of wine and morsel of food they consumed, and made a corresponding mark on his slate. Zorda was now toying with the idea of settling matters in the time-honored fashion, and braining Kromek with a wine jug. That was how he had solved most of the problems of his life. The only trouble was the innkeeper was a tough nut, a war veteran and still in good shape, so the outcome of such a course of action was anything but predictable. 2 new customers. An exceedingly good day to you, gentlemen. Smike's melodious bass voice jolted Zorda out of his violent daydream. I trust I'm permitted to enter. Smike and Rumo surveyed their surroundings. Although primitively furnished, the Glassman fulfilled the basic requirements of the innkeeper's trade. There was a makeshift bar nailed together, some rickety chairs and tables that had clearly been improvised out of tree stumps, and 2 broached barrels, one of beer and the other of wine. A half-charred Ornean marsh hog was sizzling on a spit over the open fire. Smike had often dreamt of such a spectacle on his pool of roaming rock. The startled Bloodums turned to stare at the door. Zorilla instinctively reached for this ball and chain, which was lying under the table, and Kromek gave such a start that he knocked a glass off the counter. Customers were rare enough in this wilderness, and the taproom of the Glassman had certainly never been patronized by such a strange pair. Zorda and Zorilla had never seen a Wolperting before, let alone a shark grub. Kromek, on the other hand, had seen a shark grub on at least one occasion, because Prince Hussein Banana had temporarily employed one of his minister of war. This specimen bore a strong resemblance to the war minister, but then shark grubs probably all looked alike. As for Rumo, Kromek surmised that he was a wild mongrel. Smike undulated over the bar, while Rumo remained near the door. I trust you'll permit us to warm ourselves beside the fire for a few minutes, said Smike. Kromek gave a reluctant grunt. Something to drink? I fear not, alas, my dog and I are on a strict diet for health reasons. Smike's gaze lingered on the wine barrel. His mouth watered as all the memories garnered by his taste buds and the gustatory nerves in his gums transmitted themselves from his brain to his salivary glands. Memories of vintage Grille Sunday and Burgundy, of the velvety aftertaste of Ornean rosé, of chilled Florentine Chardonnay quaffed at the height of summer, of tannin and delicate acidity, and the hint of oak imparted by the aging in the wood, of ruby-red Magardian port which caressed the tongue like silk. It was 3 years since Smike had drunk a glass of wine, smoked a fogar, or eaten roast meat. All right, but make it quick, growled Kromek Tuma, bringing Smike down to earth with a bump. This is an inn, not a waiting room. Smike wobbled over to the fire and inhaled the scent of roast pork. Big blisters were swelling and subsiding beneath the joint's blackened skin. Now and then one would burst and deflate with a faint whistle, and blobs of mingled fat and meat juice would fall into the fire, where they hissed and turned to steam. As soon as one of these appetizing little clouds rose to Smike's nostrils, his 4 stomachs began to bubble like a marsh in hot weather. Sewage gas forced its way through his intestines, which squeaked like a litter of mice, and sheer culinary excitement made him let off a mighty fart. Kromek Tuma was afraid his peculiar customer would fall into the roast pork like a ravening wolf, so he made sure his crossbow was in its proper place beneath the counter. One false move and he would nail that fat maggot to the wall. Meanwhile, Rumo continued to stand, waiting just inside the door. He registered the prevailing tension with all his senses. He could smell the cold sweat of fear. hear hearts racing. No one in that room, himself included, was behaving naturally. To him, everything smelt wrong, and that had nothing to do with his scorched nose. Smike was doing his utmost to sound amiable, but even his voice was trembling with duplicity. With an effort, he transferred his gaze from the roast pork to the two bloodums. "May one ask what card game you're playing?" Rumo said, sorta. Smike chuckled. "Ah, Rumo, my favorite game." Rumo itched to say something, but he obeyed the rules and limited himself to a low growl. "You should keep that mutt on a lead," Zorilla said ungraciously. "He won't bite you." "Funny, that's what all dog owners say," said Zorilla, and Zorda gave an evil chuckle. "Listen," Smike said gravely, "I won't try to fool you. How could I? I'm not wearing any clothes, and I don't have any luggage with me, so it's obvious I don't have a bean." The two bloodums gave a grunt of disappointment. "But I'd like to play a hand with you. I have a suggestion to make. You see that wonderful Wolperting? He's one of the wild specimens, and I'm sure you know how much in demand they are as watchdogs, especially with the farmers around here. A Wolperting has fetched 1,000 pyres at auction before now." The bloodums looked dubious. Then they noticed the horns on Rumo's head. "That's, a Wolperting? 1,000 pyres. That's for a normal Wolperting, but this one is something else. Wolpertings are very stubborn creatures. They can't really be tamed, as I'm sure you know, but this one obeys to order. Watch this." Smike looked at Rumo. "Sit. Go on, sit." Rumo went on standing there and flattened his ears, looking offended. The bloodums laughed. "Sit," Smike repeated in a thunderous voice. He gave Rumo a piercing look. Rumo reluctantly accepted the challenge in Smike's gaze, and sat down on his haunches with a growl. "You see," Smike said triumphantly, "a trained specimen, a genuine rarity, a creature without a will of its own, an obedient tool in the hands of its owner. But be careful, in the wrong hands a Wolperting can be misused. It can become a dangerous living weapon. You'd have to promise me only to use him for peaceful purposes." The bloodums leant across the table, looking interested. "What good is it to me if the beast obeys you?" Sorda demanded. "I might win him, but it wouldn't mean he'd do what I say." For a bloodum, that was extremely intelligent objection. "He'll obey anyone I trust with the authority over him," Smike replied. He waved one of his little arms in Zorda's direction. "There, now you're in charge of him. Give him an order." "What, me?" "Yes, go on. Any order you like." Zorda thought hard, then started to grin. He turned to Rumo. "All right, roll in the dirt." Rumo couldn't believe his ears. He cocked his head and narrowed his eyes. "Like hell he'll obey anyone. He didn't even understand what I said." Zorda and Zorilla laughed. Smike gave Rumo another look, a look of entreaty this time, not of insistence. Rumo gathered that learning this new combat technique required self-control and worse still a readiness to humiliate himself. That came harder to him than fighting 10 demonicals. "Tell him again," said Smike. "He understood you all right. He's a bit slow on the uptake, that's all." "Go on, you stupid mutt. Roll in the dirt," yelled the bloodum. Rumo lay down on his side and rolled to and fro on the dusty taproom floor. Wood shavings and bits of fluff became lodged in his fur. "That's more like it," said Zorilla. Smike sat down at the table. "In that case, gentlemen, if you've no objection." Zorda tossed him the pack of cards. "You deal. We'll allow you 100 pyres credit on the dog. If you lose them, that's ours. Minimum stake 10 pyres. "That seems fair enough," said Smike, shuffling the pack. Rumo foils the double crossbow. "What, Rumo? Rumo again?" snapped Zorilla, throwing down his cards. "This flat slob has all the luck. I ask you, 6 Rumos on the trot." Barely an hour had gone by, and Smike was the richest person in the Glassman. He had bet his entire stake 6 times and won every game. Zorda and Zorilla were cleaned out. They had been playing on Cromac Tuma's credit for the last 2 hands. Smike decided that it was time to carry out the test he planned. He rose and turned to Cromac. "Where can one, Cromac laughed. "Outside. Find yourself a tree." Smike undulated to the door, throwing Rumo a conspiratorial glance as he went. Rumo continued to do what he'd been doing the whole time. He lay on the filthy taproom floor and pretended to be asleep. "What are we going to do?" asked Zorilla. "He's cleaned us out completely." "We could hit him on the head with the wine jug," Zorda suggested, "in the usual way." Zorda agreed. "All right, we'll play the other hand. Afterwards, get up and refill the jug. When you come back, sneak up behind him and smash it over his head. He's a maggot. You can't tell when a maggot's head begins and ends. It was your idea. We must hit him hard enough, that's all. If he's still budging after that, I'll finish him off with my ball and chain." "But the jug goes on your bill," Cromac growled from behind the counter. He overheard every word. "We'll sell the Wolperting, or whatever it's called, and split the proceeds 3 ways," said Zorda. "Privately," he thought. "As for you, you barking idiot, you'll be the next to get a jug on the head, then we'll burn your lousy joint to the ground. We'll drag that fat slob into the woods. The werewolves will do the rest," Zorilla said, this in an undertone, because the front steps were already creaking under Smike's weight. Rumo pretended to be stirring restlessly in his sleep. He whimpered faintly and scratched the floor with his right forepaw. Just as Smike was oozing past Zorda, he did something Rumo would never have believed him capable of. Quick as a flash, he dove his head into the back of the Bloodum's neck, and Zorda crashed forward onto the tabletop. His head collided with a dice cup and catapulted it into the air. Zorilla reacted quickly. He jumped up, brandishing the ball and chain he'd concealed beneath the table. Cormac took cover behind the counter. The dice cup went skittering across the floor and shed its contents, a double 6. Rumo added to the general confusion by rising on his hind legs. "Drop that," he commanded Zorilla. Zorilla was impressed. His chin sagged, giving Rumo a good view of the ruined teeth in his lower jaw, but he didn't drop his weapon. He raised it in both hands and began to whirl it around his head. The iron ball whistled ominously as it rotated. Zorilla backed away from the table, but Rumo darted beneath it and between the Bloodum's legs before he'd grasped what the Wolperting wasn't there any longer. He reared up behind Zorilla, gripped his wrist, and wrenched it downwards. The chain wound itself around the Bloodum's neck. The ball circled him 3 times, getting closer and closer, and hit him on the head. Stunned by his own weapon, Zorilla crashed to the taproom floor, sending up a little cloud of dust. The innkeeper came out from behind the counter holding a double crossbow. He pointed at Rumo and cried, "Get out, the 2 of you, and be quick about it." "You've forgotten to cock the thing," said Smike. Cormac stopped short. Feverishly, he proceeded to fiddle with the cocking mechanism. A mechanical weapon was a novel challenge for Rumo. Smike had told him a lot about the various kinds of crossbows, the way they worked, and the speed at which their bolts traveled. This one was a Grail Sundian double arbalest with 2 bows of 8-layered birchwood, reindeer gut strings, a wrought iron stock, and a trigger mechanism such as only officially certified watchmakers were permitted to manufacture. The bolts were made of compressed reeds, twisted like ropes and armed with notched bronze tips. This lent them the requisite spin and flight and enabled them to penetrate solid brick. Click went the crossbow. Cormac aimed it at Rumo again. "Get out of here, both of you," he yelled. "What would you say to a little wager, Cormac Tuma?" asked Smike. "What? How come you know my name?" Startled, Cormac lowered his crossbow for an instant. Smike reeled off his details. "Sergeant Cormac Tuma, weigh 350 pounds, height 8 foot 3 inches, 47 decorations for gallantry in the face of an enemy, artilleryman, hard of hearing. I raised your pay 3 times. Had you forgotten?" Cormac looked bewildered. Could this really be the ex-Minister of War? "When we were encamped outside Florence," Smike went on, and his voice took on a crisp note, "Prince Hussein proposed to send the 4th Division, of which Sergeant Cormac Tuma was also a member, to attack the palisades. Although everyone knew the Florentines were waiting for them with boiling pitch, we could smell it from our camp. I persuaded the prince to break off the siege, don't you remember?" Smike had been saving this appeal to Cormac's emotions until now. He had recognized the Bloodum immediately. Cormac was somewhat older and heavier, but his face still wore the moronic expression typical of a born warrior faithful until death. Smike gave a mocking smile and extended 2 of his little arms as if about to embrace him. "Surely you remember your old Minister of War." Yes, Cormac remembered him. At the time he'd thought him a lily-livered coward. He'd been itching to brave a shower of boiling tar for this prince's sake. He would sooner have died than turn tail. The retreat from Florence had been the worst humiliation he ever suffered. "You cowardly swine! You could have trounced us Florentine with ease." Smike's little excursion into the past didn't seem to be having the desired effect. "All right, let's forget about the old days. We need some food, water, and clothing. Let's say 100 pirates to see us on our way. I bet you can kill my Wolperting with that crossbow of yours." Cormac thought hard. "What do I get in return?" "Your life will be spared." "No, I mean, what do I do if I win the bet?" "You can't win." "You're crazy, both of you. Get out of here." The Bloodum was looking rather disconcerted again. "Go on, Cormac Tuma, shoot him," Smike said sharply. Rumo was disconcerted too. Was Smike subjecting him to another test? He'd never seen how a mechanical weapon worked. Up to now, the fastest thing he'd ever had to avoid was the demonical's fist. Cormac mechanically did as he was told. The twin triggers clicked twice, releasing the gut bowstrings and loosing off both bolts simultaneously. A whirring noise filled the air. As if guided by invisible wires, the projectiles came spinning towards the Wolperting. He could see particles of dust spiraling along in their wake. The whirring noise expanded in Rumo's ears, slowing and deepening until it became a low, resonant hum. He knew what this portended. It was the moment of supreme danger when his physical and mental processes speeded up in an almost miraculous way. He had first experienced this phenomenon on the plateau of Roaming Rock when he ripped off the demonical's head. All at once he had ample time to debate how to react. There were three possibilities. He could simply bend his head aside, which would probably make the most nonchalant impression, or he could crouch down and let the bolts fly over him. That would look athletic. Or he could bend for the waist, paw, and hips and make a thoroughly daredevil impression. He simply couldn't decide. He was still pondering the problem when a fly went buzzing across the bolt's flight path. It just missed one of the left and was sucked into a slipstream. This was bad luck on the insect, Rumo sympathetically noted, because it lost both its wings to the spinning feathers and fell to the floor badly injured, instead of dying a swift and merciful death. The bolts were now only inches away. Rumo could already make out the weaponsmith's trademark on their copper tips. At that moment he heard a movement behind him. It was Zorda, who had recovered his senses and was drawing a knife from the sheath strapped to the leg beneath his trousers. The bloodhound was doing his utmost not to make a noise. He lay quite still with a head on the table's top and extracting the blade from his sheath with great deliberation, but to Rumo's ears it sounded like an executioner's axe being whetted on a grindstone. Under these circumstances, Rumo decided on a fourth method of evasion. Casually propping one fist on his hip, he inclined the upper part of his body a little to one side to avoid both crossbow bolts. At the same time he raised his other paw and brushed the feathers of one of them, only gently, but hard enough to change its direction considerably. The other bolt he intended to pluck out of the air. Just as he reached for it, he was struck by a painful realization. He might as well have planted his paw on a red-hot stove. The friction occasioned by the breaking process scorched his palm, and the shaft's tiny reed fibers tore away shreds of his skin, but he didn't let go. He tightened his grip and brought the spinning bolt to a standstill. Meanwhile, the second bolt sped on, transfixed to the tabletop on which Zorda's head was resting, and nailed the hand holding the haft of the dagger to his leg. Too shocked to utter a sound, the bloodhound passed out once more. Rumo clenched his teeth and stood there, gripping the arrow with a thin trickle of blood seeping between his fingers. Smike gave a low, admiring whistle, and Cromac Tuma started barking again. Rumo and Smike left the taproom and made their way outside. Smike tossed a half-gnawed pork chop over his shoulder and filled his lungs with tobacco smoke. Although there hadn't been any fogars in the inn, just a box of cheap Zamodian cheroots, they were quite good enough to satisfy him after years of abstinence. His eyelids were heavy with wine, but his heart was lighter than it had been in a long time. Having drained a jug of Cromac Tuma's red wine without drawing breath, he was feeling liberated, free at last from the memories and fears that had haunted him ever since Roaming Rock. He was truly back in civilization. "I am quicker than other creatures," said Rumo. He was still marveling at his own achievement. "Much quicker," said Smike, blowing a smoke ring. "You're a Wolperting." Rumo tugged at his new clothes. He was wearing Zorilla's scuffed leather pants, which ended just below his knees, and a troll fur waistcoat taken from Cromac Tuma. Both garments reeked of bloodhound. "Do I really have to wear these?" he asked Smike. Smike was wearing a purse in one of his predatory little hands. He shook it, listening entranced to its jingling contents. "Yes," he said, "you do." "One thing struck me as odd," Rumo said, as they left the Glassman Tavern and set off in an easterly direction. "Really? What?" "That card game had the same name as me." "Yes," Smike grinned. "Funny, isn't it?" The Nocturnomath. That night they camped in a small wood that struck them as safe. At least Rumo picked up no alarming signals. They lit a fire, which meant that Rumo, under Smike's instructions, gathered some dry grass, bark, and twigs, and knocked two specially selected stones together until sparks flew from them and ignited the kindling. "That's something else I've taught you," said Smike. He was lounging on a soft bed of maple leaves and sampling a skin of red wine appropriated from the glass man. Rumo had sniffed it and declined with thanks, so Smike had it all to himself. "You're clever with your hands. People of my age are past making fires. In the larger cities, public braziers tended by glimmerdwarfs glow on every street corner. You pay them a copper for blazing torch and take it home with you. That's the way it ought to be." A swarm of elf wasps circled the fire. Crackchafers buzzed around Smike's head, menacing with their tiny pincers, and the will-o'-the-wisps darted giggling through the rising smoke. Springtime in Zamodia had unleashed hordes of insects. Death-defying dust moths plunged into the flames and exploded with a hiss. Smike grimaced with distaste. That's what I dislike most about the great outdoors. It belongs to the insects. Well, they're welcome to it. Insects can have the countryside as long as we have the cities. We'll steer clear of the great outdoors and insects steer clear of the cities. That would be a fair division. What business has a spider in a bedroom? As much as we have in this confounded wood. Rumo was busy blowing the fire as instructed by Smike. It fascinated him to see how fast the flames took hold. In the civilized world, we kill insects when we come across them, Smike went on plaintively. Insects do the same to us, but in a more subtle way. In this district, there are said to be mummy ticks whose bite doesn't simply kill you, it makes you undead. Can you imagine that? No bigger than a grain of sand. They lurk in trees for years and land on your head if you're unwise enough to sit down beneath them. Then they burrow into your brain and lay their eggs there. You don't even notice it, but when the eggs hatch, your head goes moldy inside and you turn into a walking corpse that lives on moths. Rumo looked up at the leafy canopy overhead and ruffled his fur. Smike's gaze brightened when he looked back at the flames. He was thinking of big city fires, of skyscrapers as high as the Gloomberg Mountains, of streets lined with busy shops, of inns and taverns. He knew of a bar in Grailsund where a branch exploded in the fire and brought him down to earth again. I wish we had a little swamp hog we could roast, he sighed. I know an excellent recipe for swamp hog in which caraway seeds play a sensational part. Did you know that caraway seeds go perfectly with resinous cheese? Rumo wished Smike would give his monologues a rest, if only for a moment. He had scented something and wanted to monitor the wood without being distracted by the shark grub's chatter. He shut his eyes and concentrated hard. The results gleaned by his nose and ears were contradictory and confusing. He could smell a living creature hidden in the undergrowth some 20 paces away, and a heartbeat, which he could hear, was slow and regular, from which he deduced that no attack was to be feared, unless the creature was so self-assured that not even the imminence of combat made its pulses race. But he could also hear another 4 organs at work, an incessant crunching, cracking sound. Rumo had never encountered anyone whose insides produced such noises. Tomorrow we'll go hunting, Smike ordained. It's time you got over your aversion. It's against your nature. I'll teach you how to hunt. We may even find a swamp hog. The ground is marshy enough, or there's something over there in the undergrowth, Rumo whispered. Some creature or creatures. I can hear puzzling noises. Puzzling noises? Smike lowered his voice too. What sort of noises? Crunches and crackles. They could be bodily organs functioning, but I've never heard anything like them before. There seem to be 4 of them. Cracker crats have several livers, I believe, whispered Smike. But they only operate in packs. He deplored his lack of general knowledge, because he was far from sure of either assertion. 2 lights shone on the undergrowth. They were circular, yellowish, and not particularly bright, but they appeared so suddenly that Rumo reared up his attack stance, and Smite reached for a thin branch. Then the lights began to move towards them. The bushes parted, and out of the undergrowth stepped a wizened little creature, with a disproportionately large head on its shoulders. The lights turned out to be its big, round, luminous eyes, and the movements of this peculiar apparition were so clumsy and ill-coordinated that Rumo instinctively relaxed. I trust I didn't startle you, gentlemen, the nocturnal visitor said in a high-pitched, nasal, almost arrogant voice, but I saw the fire, and since I was passing through a relatively uninhabited district where campfires are conspicuous by reason of their statistical rarity, my curiosity was aroused, and I took the liberty of coming closer. I myself never would have dared to light a fire in this part of the world, given its scientifically proven incidence of werewolves and ludowraiths, but a little defensive community like yours can afford to do so, eh? A nocturnomath, said Smike. Yes, you're right, I'm a nocturnomath. In other words, gentlemen, I'm harmless. I'm dangerous only on the mental plane, so you'd better not cross swords with me when it comes to intellectual matters, haha. Permit me to introduce myself. My name is Colibri, Professor Ostafan Colibri. Smike was impressed by the fearless way this frail little gnome had walked up to him in Rumo. He was evidently a mind-reader and bore a faint resemblance to the professor from whom Smike had acquired his knowledge of the demonical's tongues in Fort Una. He had the same glowing eyes, the same puny body, the same outsized head, but something about him was different. You're welcome, said Smike. We should be glad to share our campfire with any well-disposed wayfarer. The Atlantean Hiker's Code laid it down that this was the traditional sentence to be recited on such occasions, originally formulated by some Natufolfian politicians whose hobby was hiking. It signalized courtesy and hospitality, but it also conveyed a veiled threat, being a clear intimation. The hosts would defend themselves vigorously if attacked by their guests or guests. There was no legal obligation to use this flowery phrase, but it was widely recognized and taught in many Simonian schools. The correct response to it ran, "I thank you for your offer of hospitality and promise not to take undue advantage of it." "I thank you for your offer of hospitality and promise not to take undue advantage of it." Ostafan Calibri replied and added, "I feel I should mention that I am in possession of some Midgardian biltong sausages, which, in return for your hospitality, I should be happy to share with you campfire-owing gentlemen." Would that be convenient? The Nocturnomath's trademark was a certain linguistic eccentricity believed by many scientists to be a form of disease stemming from the immense output of words generated by their multiple brains. Calibri held up a cloth bag from which he extracted a thin, long sausage. "It would indeed be convenient," Smike exclaimed. Delightedly, he beckoned their nocturnal visitor closer. Although Rumo had abandoned his hostile stance, he remained alert and eyed Calibri suspiciously. Once the newcomer's contribution had been silently consumed beside the crackling campfire, Smike got the biggest share. The Nocturnomath ate very little, and Rumo abstained altogether. Smike endeavored to strike up a civilized conversation. "May one inquire where your travelers are taking you?" he asked. "I'm on my way to Merkholm." Smike stared at Calibri in astonishment. "Merkholm," Calibri went on, "lies north of Florence on the coast of West "I know," Smike broke in. "I was only wondering, are you going there voluntarily?" The Nocturnomath laughed. "I'm familiar with the old saying about Merkholm. If you go to Merkholm, don't bring any Merk home," Smike amplified. They both laughed politely. Rumo stared uncomprehendingly at the fire. "I've only heard the usual rumors," Smike went on. "How the city is eternally blanketed in fog, how people keep disappearing there, that sort of thing. My own state of knowledge is a little better. I'm going there to conduct some scientific experiments. I may be able to substitute proven facts for some of the wilder stories and theories about the place." "Stories? What stories? Are you really interested?" "Stories always interest me." "Are you acquainted with the legend of Netherworld?" "Netherworld?" Smike said inquiringly. Rumo pricked up his ears too. "The world beneath the world, the kingdom of evil, etc." Calibri waggled his bony fingers in the air. "I've heard the odd rumor," said Smike. "Superstitious nonsense, barrack room gossip." "Shall I?" said Calibri. "Please do," Smike replied. Merkholm. The professor threw a dry log on the fire. "For many centuries now, things have been happening in Zamonia for which there's no satisfactory explanation. Whenever they do, folks start muttering about Netherworld. Where do Demerara dragons hail from? Netherworld. Where do the inhabitants of Nerland disappear to? Netherworld. Where did the Nerns come from? Netherworld. Where did General TikTok and his copper killers escape to? Netherworld." Rumo stiffened. Did this dwarf know about General TikTok? "So what's the answer?" asked Mike. "Is there a genuine connection?" "That's the question. People have always had a tendency to divide everything into two categories, above and below, light and dark, good and evil. Scientists, on the other hand, strive to illuminate and define the areas between them. Massed in Netherworld, so it said, are the forces that thrust Simonia to the surface, the scum that will one day rise and take over the whole continent. Theoretically, Netherworld is a gigantic cave system running beneath Simonia, a world of darkness filled with dangerous and demonic life forms. There are many legends concerning Netherworld, one of them being that Merkholm is the secret entrance to it." "Ha-ha," said Smike. "Yes, ha-ha," said the professor, "an incorrigible old wives' tale. On the other hand, what about all the people who keep disappearing into the neighborhood of Merkholm? What about the inhabitants' strange behavior? Last but not least, what about the scientifically unaccountable behavior of the fog over the city which never disperses?" "You arouse my curiosity," said Smike. "Let's stick to the facts as we know them," said Calibri. "Not far north of Florence, on the west coast of Simonia, stands the city of Merkholm, which owes its name to the ultra-stable pall of fog that covers over it. Some especially simple souls believe this fog to be a living creature, and you'd be surprised how many far more preposterous little myths surround that part of the world, but as so often those myths contain a microscopic grain of truth. If that grain of truth exists in Merkholm, I shall find it, preserve it, dissect it, measure it, and draw my scientific conclusions. I specialize in microscopic life forms." "What methods do you use?" asked Smike. "As a scientist, do you favor some kind of a tactical approach?" Well, my first step will be to go to Merkholm in person. I've already sent my equipment on ahead and rented a lighthouse there. The Merkholmers are more helpful than generally believed. A few polite letters did the trick. That in itself was almost enough to disprove all my myths. People often go there on holiday, after all, so it can't be as bad as all that. You've got guts, Smike said admiringly. Pah! If no one had ever shed light on darkness, we would still be sitting in caves, convinced that clouds are flying mountains. What will you do when you get to Merkholm? Investigate the fog, of course. I shall take an aurocardiogram of it. A what? Please don't ask me to explain. I wouldn't want to spoil our evening, but I'll tell you this much. I intend to examine the fog's microscopic heart. All secrets can be fathomed in miniature. Aha, said Smike.